There is a castle in the center of Scotland that almost nobody outside the country puts on their itinerary. The tourists go to Edinburgh. They queue for the castle on the volcanic plug in the middle of the old city, and they file through the crown room to see the honors, and they photograph the view from the esplanade, and they buy the shortbread tin on the way out. Edinburgh Castle is what they came for. It is what Scotland's tourism industry tells them to want. Here is what the Edinburgh branding leaves out. The castle at Stirling, 45 minutes to the northwest, is the more historically significant building. More Scottish kings and queens were born here, crowned here, or died violently in its shadow than at Edinburgh. The story of Mary Queen of Scots begins here. Not at Holyrood. The most important battle in Scottish history was fought because of this castle. The finest Renaissance building in the British Isles stands inside its walls. The royal nursery of the Stuart dynasty was here, not in Edinburgh, and the Scottish king, who would go on to rule England, was raised within these walls from infancy, shaped by tutors who worked in this place, and left it for London, never to return. Stirling Castle has not been kept quiet because it is less significant than Edinburgh. It has been kept quiet because what happened here is much harder to make into a comfortable story. Violent monarchs, murdered regents, child kings, a queen who saw her son for the last time in this castle and never held him again. A dynasty that seems constitutionally cursed, every single one of them reaching the throne as a child because their predecessor died violently before their time. This is Stirling Castle, not Edinburgh's quieter cousin, the original. The place where Scotland's history actually happened, on the rock above the only crossing of the River Forth, where whoever held the bridge held the country. Chapter 1. The rock before the castle prehistoric foundations, the Romans, and the brooch of Scotland. The volcanic crag on which Stirling Castle stands is not a natural feature in the tourist brochure sense of something beautiful and incidental. It is a geological fact that determined Scottish political history for 2,000 years. The Castle Rock at Stirling is one of several volcanic intrusions in the central belt of Scotland. The solidified cores of ancient volcanoes whose surrounding rock was ground away by glaciation, leaving steep-sided plugs standing above the flatter terrain. Edinburgh Castle Rock is the most famous. The one at Stirling is, from a strategic perspective, more important. It sits at the narrowest crossing point of the River Forth, the great estuary that effectively divides Scotland into the Highlands to the north and the Lowlands to the south, and it commands that crossing from three sheer sides, with only a gradual approach from the east accessible to attacking forces. The World History Encyclopedia summary of the castle's position states the geopolitical reality directly. The castle has been described as the brooch, which joins the two halves of Scotland. Whoever held it controlled the movement of armies, goods, people, and political authority between the two fundamentally different geographical zones that constitute the country. This is not metaphor, it is military geography. An army marching from the south into the Highlands could not bypass Stirling without leaving its supply lines dangerously exposed. An army marching south from the Highlands could not effectively enter the Lowlands without securing the fourth crossing. This meant that the rock above the river was not merely a useful fortification, it was the strategic key to the whole country. Control Stirling, control Scotland. The phrase is an old one, and it was true for most of the period it covered. Human beings understood this before any written record exists. The Britons of the Arthries area site atop the crag, from at least the Iron Age, the World History Encyclopedia's survey, suggests there may well have been a hilltop fort here in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, controlled by the Meatai tribe, one of the peoples who lived north of the Roman frontier. What those Iron Age fortifications looked like, what they contained, how long they were occupied. The physical evidence for all of this was obliterated by the continuous building of the medieval and Renaissance periods that followed. The Romans, who pushed north through Scotland on multiple occasions without ever permanently subduing it, understood the fourth crossing. The Antonine Wall, the turf and stone frontier, erected across the Central Belt around AD 142 under the Emperor Antoninus Pius, running from the Firth of Clyde to the Firth of Forth, passed close enough to the Stirling position to confirm that Roman military planners were thinking about the same geography that would preoccupy Scottish and English strategists for the next 12 centuries. The historian Hector Boece, writing in the 16th century, claimed that the Romans under Agricola had actually fortified the Stirling Rock, a claim that Wikipedia's article on Stirling Castle notes without endorsing, since Boece is considered an unreliable historian. The Antonine Wall was abandoned within a generation of its construction, the Caledonians proving too difficult to suppress permanently. But the Roman fort at Camelon, just north of modern Falkirk, and the patterns of Roman road construction in the area confirm that the Stirling position was militarily significant to them, whether or not they fortified the rock itself. The Votadini, the Brittonic people whose territory encompassed much of southeast Scotland, and who had a major centre at what is now Edinburgh, knew the crossing. Their successors in various forms of post-Roman political organization knew it. The early medieval kingdoms of northern Britain, Manno Gododin, Strathclyde, the nascent kingdom of the Scots, all understood the Forth as a frontier whose crossing was worth controlling. Whether there was a permanent fortification on the rock in the centuries between the Romans and the first documentary evidence in 1110 is genuinely unknown. The archaeology cannot establish it because the later building has obliterated the evidence. The written sources say nothing, because there are no written sources for this period that speak to the castle specifically. The first documented reference is that King Alexander I dedicated a chapel at Stirling around 1110. This is not the founding of a castle, it is the recording of a chapel at an already established royal site. The castle existed. The chapel was new. This means the castle predates 1110. But by how much is not established. The early 12th century records describe a site that is already a functioning royal installation, a place where a king feels confident enough to endow a religious house, which implies permanent occupation and royal authority over the location. What those earliest records do not tell us is how long the castle had already been there, or what it looked like. The first buildings were probably timber structures on stone footings, the standard construction of the period across Britain, and the form that the sources themselves imply when they describe, before Alfonso VIII's transformative stonework, a wooden stockade fence at Segovia. The medieval convention of stone construction on earlier timber sites was universal enough that we can reasonably infer something similar at Stirling. There was fortification here before the stone buildings. There was probably fortification here before the Normans and the Scottish kings who adopted their methods arrived to systematize it. The geological fact came first. The human recognition of it came almost as quickly. The political history that grew from both stretched for 2,000 years on the same 20 acres of volcanic rock above the River Forth. Chapter 2. The Castle of Kings. Alexander, David, and the development of Royal Stirling. From Alexander I's chapel dedication in 1110 through the catastrophic succession crisis of 1286, Stirling Castle's history is the history of a functioning royal installation that served the Scottish crown, without generating the dramatic episodes that fill later chapters. This is not nothing. Functioning royal administrations, the kind that allowed Scotland to develop as a genuine European kingdom, with its own legal institutions, its own church, its own international relationships, are built on exactly the kind of continuous institutional presence that a castle like Stirling provided. The drama comes later. First comes the machinery. Alexander I, who died in 1124, was the son of Malcolm III, the king who ended Macbeth's reign, the king whose story Shakespeare dramatized with substantial freedom from historical fact. The chapel Alexander endowed at Stirling was a gesture of religious patronage that also expressed royal authority. The king, declaring his ownership of the site through a religious act, the standard medieval method of marking territory as royal. Scotland, in 1110, was a kingdom in the process of defining itself against its neighbours. Viking pressure from the north, English pressure from the south, internal pressure from the still distinct peoples, Scots, Picts, Britons, Angles, who had been brought together under the Canmore dynasty through conquest, marriage, and the slow work of shared administration. The castle at Stirling was one of the tools through which the dynasty made its authority real in the landscape. Alexander I, when he succeeded in 1124 by his younger brother David I, one of the most important figures in Scottish medieval history, a man who spent his formative years at the English court of Henry I and brought back with him an understanding of Norman administrative methods, feudal land tenure, and ecclesiastical organization that he systematically deployed in Scotland. Under David, Scotland was reorganized on broadly Norman lines, not through conquest, as in England, but through deliberate importation. Norman families were invited north, given Scottish lands, and inserted into the existing social structure as the new aristocracy. The result was a kingdom that was genuinely hybrid Celtic in its cultural inheritance, Norman in much of its administrative and ecclesiastical apparatus, Latin in its international ecclesiastical connections. David was at Stirling frequently enough that his presence there was recorded in multiple charters. His successors, Malcolm IV, William the Lion, Alexander II, were at Stirling. The castle served as one of several royal residences that the peripatetic Scottish court rotated between, following the rhythms of administration and the practical need to consume food renders from different parts of the kingdom, rather than concentrating everything in one location. Stirling's strategic centrality made it a natural administrative node, not the only one, but consistently one of the most important. The Exchequer records the financial accounts of the Scottish Crown, which survive from this period, show regular royal expenditure at Stirling on building, repairs, and household supplies, the routine evidence of a working royal residence. The castle in David's time was already beginning to acquire the institutional functions that would make it politically central for the next 4 centuries. It housed the royal treasury at various points. It served as a residence for the king and his household on their circuits of the kingdom. It was associated with the dispensing of royal justice, the king sitting in session, hearing cases, issuing writs, performing the ceremonial functions through which abstract royal authority was made tangible in specific places at specific times. The park around the castle, mentioned in a document from the reign of William I, between 1165 and 1174, was a hunting ground of the kind that medieval kings maintained as both practical amenity and political symbol. Royal parks were assertions of exclusive territorial rights. Having a park adjacent to Stirling was a statement that this was royal ground in a deep sense that went beyond the mere possession of a fortification. William I is associated with Stirling in a specific way that reflects the castle's developing institutional function. Captured by English forces in 1174 at the Battle of Alnwick while raiding into northern England, William was held prisoner by Henry II and released on humiliating terms the Treaty of Falaise, which required him to pay homage to the English king and surrender several Scottish castles, including Stirling, as security for his compliance. For the next 15 years, Stirling was held by English garrisons. This is the first, but very much not the last, time the castle's flag changed from Scottish to English. The pattern that would define the castle's role in the Wars of Independence 2 centuries later, the strategic pivot around which Scottish and English ambitions turned, was already visible in 1174. A Scottish king captured, humiliated, required to hand over Stirling. An English garrison installed. Scottish independence reduced to nominal status. The humiliation of Falaise was reversed in 1189 when Richard I of England, needing cash for the Third Crusade, sold back the quitclaim of Scottish independence to William for 10,000 marks, the so-called quitclaim of Canterbury, which the chronicler later called the greatest bargain Scotland ever made. Stirling returned to Scottish hands. The pattern, once established, would repeat. English control, Scottish recovery. English control, Scottish recovery. The castle changing hands as the political relationship between the two crowns fluctuated between submission and resistance. Alexander II extended Scottish royal authority southward, secured the Scottish border in roughly its modern position by treaty with England in 1237, and managed a reign of sustained competence that set the foundations for what his son would inherit. Alexander III's reign, 1249–1286, was the high water mark of medieval Scottish prosperity and stability, the reign that posterity remembered as the Golden Age, the benchmark against which subsequent misery was measured. He was competent. His kingdom was productive. His international relationships were well managed. His court at Stirling and his other residences was a functioning institution. The great contemporary ballad lamenting his death captured the loss precisely. What whennies this world is. Joy is become sadness. Alexander III was the last of the long, competent succession. What died with him at the foot of the Fife Cliff was not just a king, but the confident assumption that Scotland's independence was permanent. What followed, as the Edinburgh Castle script established, was Edward I's adjudication of the succession dispute, John Balliol's selection and subsequent subordination to English demands, the humiliating stripping of Balliol's royal regalia at Montrose, and the beginning of the Wars of Independence. For Stirling, the wars were not distant events, whose consequences arrived later. The castle was at the center of the conflict from the beginning, the most important fortification in Scotland, the prize that defined the strategic situation of whoever held it, the position whose possession or absence determined whether Scotland was genuinely independent or effectively occupied. Chapter 3. The most contested castle in Britain, Wallace, Bruce, and the Wars of Independence. Stirling Castle changed hands more times during the Wars of Independence than any other major fortification in Scotland. Between 1296 and 1314, it passed between Scottish and English control at least 8 times. Understanding why requires only a moment with the map. Edward I invaded Scotland in 1296, imposed his administrative apparatus, and used Stirling as the seat of English governance in the north. The same function he gave Edinburgh Castle, but Stirling's position at the Forth Crossing made it more important strategically than Edinburgh when it came to military control of the whole country. Scottish forces operating in the Highlands could not pose a credible threat to English power in the Lowlands so long as the English held Stirling. Conversely, a Scottish army that held Stirling could cut English supply lines between the south and any forces operating north of the Forth. William Wallace understood this with the clarity of someone who had been thinking about guerrilla warfare against a better-resourced opponent. The Battle of Stirling Bridge on 11 September 1297 was fought, as its name states, at the Stirling River, crossing beneath the walls of the castle that remained in English hands. Wallace and Andrew de Moray commanded a Scottish force on the north bank of the Forth. The English army crossed the bridge in the kind of sequential formation that turns military strength into a series of small, manageable portions. The Scots waited for enough of the English force to cross to be cut off from retreat, then attacked. The English commander, Hugh de Cressingham, was killed. The English forces on the north bank were destroyed or drowned. The remainder retreated. It was the most complete Scottish victory since the beginning of the wars, and it was achieved specifically because Wallace chose to fight at the strategic point whose control mattered most. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge did not take the castle itself, which remained in English hands, but it demonstrated what Scottish forces could achieve when fighting at the hinge point of Scotland's geography. Edward I responded with his formidable personal determination. He invaded again in 1298 and defeated Wallace at Falkirk, where English longbow superiority proved decisive against the Scottish schiltron formations in open ground. Wallace survived, but his political position was destroyed. He resigned the guardianship of Scotland and continued guerrilla operations for 7 years, until his capture and execution in 1305. The 1304 siege of Stirling Castle is one of the more extraordinary episodes in the castle's long history of being fought over. Edward I invested the siege with characteristic thoroughness, not merely surrounding the castle with men, but constructing the most elaborate siege train ever assembled by an English army in Scotland. He ordered churches stripped of their lead for ballista ammunition. He brought stone and iron from as far as Brecon and St. Andrews. And he built the Warwolf, a trebuchet of exceptional size, a siege engine whose construction was apparently so impressive that when the Scottish garrison finally offered surrender, Edward refused to accept until he had seen the Warwolf in action at least once. The garrison, under Sir William Oliphant, was required to watch the machine they could no longer resist throw its stones at the castle before they were allowed to walk out. Edward got his demonstration. The garrison surrendered and was imprisoned. English control of Stirling was restored. It would not last. After Edward I's death in 1307, Robert Bruce's campaign to consolidate his kingship over Scotland proceeded systematically. By 1313, Bruce held almost everything castle by castle, province by province. The English grip on Scotland was being loosened. Only Stirling, Edinburgh, Roxburgh, and Berwick remained in English hands. And it was the situation at Stirling that produced the greatest military confrontation of the entire war. Edward Bruce, Robert's younger brother, laid siege to Stirling in early 1313. The English governor, Sir Philip Mowbray, who was himself Scottish, the Wars of Independence, were fought across a landscape of divided loyalties. Not a clean national confrontation proposed a bargain. He would surrender the castle if it had not been relieved by an English force within 1 year. By midsummer 1314, Edward Bruce accepted the terms. Robert Bruce, learning what his brother had agreed, was not pleased. The deal gave Edward II of England a fixed objective, a fixed date, and a full year to prepare, neutralizing precisely the strategic advantages of unpredictability and terrain knowledge that Bruce's campaign had exploited so effectively. The historian Patrick Fraser Tytler, writing 5 centuries later, described the acceptance as generating conditions which ought on no account to have been accepted. What followed was the Battle of Bannockburn, fought on 23 to 24 June 1314, 2 miles south of Stirling Castle, on ground that Robert Bruce had chosen with care. Edward II assembled an army estimated at 13,000 to 20,000 men, one of the largest English forces ever sent north. Bruce had perhaps 7,000, predominantly pikemen, with almost no cavalry. The Scottish victory was total. Edward II fled the battlefield on horseback, was refused entry to the castle by the English governor who feared his capture, and made for Dunbar, where he escaped by ship. The castle's governor, his position now untenable, surrendered to Bruce. Bruce demolished it, as he had demolished Edinburgh, Roxburgh, and every other Scottish castle he captured that could be reoccupied and held against him by English forces. His strategic doctrine throughout the wars was to deny the English fortified bases rather than to use those bases himself. Stirling Castle was slighted, its defenses systematically destroyed to prevent its reuse. The castle that had been at the center of Scottish and English military calculations for nearly 2 decades was, within weeks of the greatest Scottish victory in history, a deliberate ruin. This decision requires a moment's thought. Bruce had just won Bannockburn. His hold on the Scottish kingdom was the most secure it had ever been. He could have garrisoned Stirling with Scottish soldiers and used it as his own administrative center. The castle's strategic position, the brooch of Scotland, controlling the Forth Crossing, was as valuable to a Scottish king as it was to an English one. Why demolish it? The answer is strategic and shows how completely Bruce understood the nature of his own position. He did not have the resources to garrison every captured castle indefinitely. An English return possible at any point, given the ongoing hostility of Edward II, would give any English army an immediate objective in each castle Bruce held. By demolishing them, he removed the English army's intermediate objectives and forced any future English invasion to fight its way north from the border through open country with no fortified bases to shelter in and resupply from. The demolition of Stirling was not an act of spite. It was a calculated military decision by a commander who understood that the geography he could not control was less dangerous than the fortifications he could not keep staffed. The castle was rebuilt, of course. Stone and location both outlast the decisions of individual kings. By the late 14th century, when the Trastamara dynasty in Castile was building their way to legitimacy at the Alcazar of Segovia, the Stuart kings of Scotland were doing the same thing at Stirling. The same impulse, using architecture to make power permanent, expressed itself in both castles at roughly the same time, in different countries, with different aesthetic vocabularies and the same political logic. Chapter 4. The Curse of the Jameses: How a Dynasty Tried to Build Its Way Out of Violence. The Stuart dynasty came to the Scottish throne in 1371 through Robert II, grandson of Robert Bruce, and what followed over the next century is one of the most grimly systematic sequences of royal misfortune in European history. Every single James who followed, and there were 5 of them in a row before the series ended, reached the throne as a minor, because his father had died violently before his time. The castle at Stirling was at the center of most of these catastrophes. Robert II was not himself one of the violent deaths. He died in his 74th year, the oldest medieval Scottish monarch on record. In 1390, his son Robert III was equally unfortunate in a different register, neither murdered nor killed in battle, but so comprehensively sidelined by the powerful magnates of his own court that his biographer described him as the worst of kings and the most miserable of men. He was not wrong. Robert III suffered from injuries that left him physically debilitated, handed effective governance to his younger brother, the Duke of Albany, and watched his elder son, Rothesay, die in captivity, probably starved by Albany, though this was never proved. When his second son, James, was captured by English pirates in 1406, while being sent to France for his safety, Robert III received the news and died of grief within weeks. James was 12 years old. He spent the next 18 years as a prisoner of the English crown, before being ransomed and returned to Scotland in 1424. He had been kept long enough to learn English administrative methods, English court culture, English poetry. He wrote the Kingus Quair, a remarkable poem, during his captivity, and to develop a comprehensive plan for what he would do when he got home. James I was assassinated in Perth in 1437, stabbed multiple times in a sewer drain where he had fled when his chambers were broken into. His son, James II, became king at 6 years old. James II's reign is associated with Stirling Castle in 2 specific and memorable ways, both involving a degree of violence that the formal architectural record of the castle's development tends to underplay. In February 1452, James II invited William Douglas, 8th Earl of Douglas, to dinner at Stirling Castle, under a guarantee of safe conduct. The relationship between the Crown and the Douglas family, the Black Douglases, whose power and territorial holdings constituted something close to a rival sovereignty within Scotland, had deteriorated to the point where James decided to address it directly. The dinner was a trap. James, too, stabbed the Earl of Douglas personally, reportedly demanding first that Douglas break his alliance with other magnates, Douglas refusing, James producing a knife. His companions finished the job. The body was thrown from a window. The murder of a guest, under a royal safe conduct, by the king himself, in the castle at Stirling, was an act of extraordinary violence, even by the standards of 15th-century Scottish politics. The Scottish Parliament subsequently accepted James's argument that Douglas's treasonous alliances had forfeited the protection of the safe conduct. The logic was convenient, and the acceptance was politically motivated. The nobles who might have objected had their own reasons not to. The Black Douglases were not universally popular, and the king's demonstrated willingness to use lethal force personally was a form of political communication that the nobility could read clearly. 8 years later, James II was dead, killed by his own cannon at the siege of Roxburgh in 1460. Standing too close to one of the new Flemish guns he loved when it exploded, his thigh bone split by a fragment of iron, death rapid. He was 29 years old. His 9-year-old son became James III. James III's reign from 1460 to 1488 is characterized by the sources as a progressive deterioration of the relationship between a culturally sophisticated king and a military nobility that found his preferences insufficiently martial. He patronized painters and musicians. He commissioned the Trinity altarpiece from the Flemish painter Hugo van der Goes, one of the finest works of Flemish painting outside the Netherlands, and still a major possession of the National Galleries of Scotland. He was accused of debasing the currency. He promoted favorites of low birth. His architect, Robert Cochrane, was the most notorious, whose influence over him the magnates found intolerable. His own queen, Margaret of Denmark, withdrew from his company and went to live at Stirling Castle while he remained in Edinburgh, the castle, as the refuge of a royal marriage that had functionally ended before the Queen's death in 1486. Norman MacDougall, whose biography of James III is the definitive modern study, noted that his difficulties with the magnates were not resolved after the executions at Lauder Bridge and continued to fester until the final confrontation. That final confrontation came at the Battle of Sauchiburn in June 1488, fought on the field just south of Stirling on the old Bannockburn ground. As contemporaries noted with the awareness of historical resonance, James III's own son was the figurehead of the rebel nobility. His father was defeated and killed. One account, written nearly a century later, and widely doubted, describes a man presenting himself as a priest being summoned to give last rites to the wounded king, and instead stabbing him. Whether this happened exactly as described, James III was dead, and his 15-year-old son became James IV of Scotland. James IV wore an iron belt around his waist for the rest of his life as penance for his role in his father's death. He added a new link every year. This is not a metaphor. The actual belt was on his actual body at the Battle of Flodden in 1513 when he died, though its precise fate after his death is unknown, since his body was badly mutilated in the fighting and his remains were not immediately recovered. James IV is the figure who transformed Stirling physically into what visitors see today. He had inherited a castle that, despite the dramatic events of the Wars of Independence and the subsequent Stuart occupation, was architecturally modest by the standards of European royal residences. He changed this systematically. He built the forework, the grand turreted gatehouse facade that remains the castle's primary street entrance in the style of French military architecture. He built the King's Old Building in 1496 as a residential suite. He built the Great Hall between 1500 and 1503, a room of extraordinary ambition, at 38 meters by 11 meters, the largest secular space in Scotland, with a hammerbeam roof of exceptional quality and bay windows that flooded the interior with light. The Great Hall was designed to host the largest gatherings of the Scottish court, and to impress foreign visitors in the way that the court of a Renaissance monarch was expected to impress. James played tennis at Stirling with the Spanish ambassador. He received international embassies in these rooms. He was, by his biographer Norman MacDougall's assessment, Scotland's first Renaissance king, the first to understand that royal power could be expressed through cultural patronage and architectural magnificence as effectively as through military force. He was also the last British monarch to die in battle. At Flodden, 9 September 1513, the same date, 30 years later, on which his granddaughter Mary would be crowned at Stirling. On the battle's anniversary, James IV was killed, leading a charge against the English position on Branxton Hill. He was 40 years old. His infant son became James V of Scotland. James V rebuilt Stirling again. He spent the 1530s and 1540s constructing the royal palace that visitors walk through today, the first true Renaissance palace in the British Isles, according to John Dunbar, drawing on James's experience of French court culture during his marriages to Madeleine of Valois in 1537, and then Mary of Guise in 1538. The outer walls of the palace are covered with carved stonework, depicting classical deities, mythological figures, and human faces. The Stirling heads, the remarkable series of oak roundels that survive in the National Museum of Scotland and are reproduced in the restored palace interiors today, among the finest examples of Renaissance wood carving north of the Alps. James V died in 1542, aged 30, without seeing his palace completed. He died of an illness exacerbated by military failure, a disastrous Scottish defeat at Solway Moss in November 1542, when an invading Scottish force fell apart almost without battle and political despair. His last recorded words, hearing of the birth of a daughter when he had wanted a son, were reportedly, "It came, we alas," and "It'll gang, we alas." The dynasty had come to the Stuarts through Marjorie Bruce, Robert Bruce's daughter. It would, James predicted, end through a woman. He was not entirely wrong, though the manner of its ending took longer and was stranger than any deathbed prophecy could have anticipated. That daughter was Mary. She was 6 days old when she became Queen of Scots. Her coronation was at Stirling Castle. Chapter 5. The Queen in the Nursery Mary, the Rough Wooing, and a Castle Under Threat. Mary, Queen of Scots, was 9 months old when she was crowned Queen of Scotland in the Chapel Royal at Stirling Castle on 9 September 1543. The date was chosen, and the choice was either poorly considered or deliberately significant, in a way that nobody admitted publicly. 9 September 1543 was the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Flodden, where Mary's grandfather, James IV, had been killed. The coronation of a 9-month-old queen on the anniversary of the worst Scottish military defeat in living memory was the kind of coincidence that the superstitious medieval political imagination could not simply ignore. Some sources suggest nobody noticed, or that the anniversary was not specifically in mind. Others suggest it was impossible that those organizing the coronation did not know the date they had chosen. The English ambassador Ralph Sadler, a Thomas Cromwell protege, whose dispatches back to London provide a contemporaneous record of Scottish political conditions, watched the ceremony and reported with barely concealed condescension that it was conducted with such solemnity as they do use in this country, which is not very costly. Sadler was not impressed. The infant, reportedly, was. In her mother's arms, accounts describe the 9-month-old Mary thrusting out her hand to grip the scepter eagerly, a gesture that the assembled nobles chose to read as divinely inspired enthusiasm. The English crown's interest in the occasion was not ceremonial. Henry VIII had been attempting to negotiate a marriage between Mary and his own son Edward, which would have effectively incorporated Scotland into an English dynastic union. The Treaty of Greenwich, signed in July 1543, had promised exactly this: Scotland and England unified through marriage, with specific treaty guarantees that the kingdoms would remain legally separate. The Scottish Parliament rejected it in December 1543, drove Regent Arran back toward the Catholic French faction, and Scotland found itself at war with England within months of the coronation. Henry VIII's response to the rejection was the campaign that Scottish history calls the Rough Wooing, a series of devastating English military incursions designed to force Scotland into accepting the marriage alliance by destroying enough of its infrastructure and agricultural base to make resistance untenable. The Earl of Hertford burned Edinburgh in May 1544, destroying the Abbey of Holyrood and sacking the town. He returned and burned Edinburgh again, along with Melrose Abbey, Dryburgh, Kelso, and numerous other sites. In 1545 and 1547, the Battle of Pinkie in September 1547 was a devastating English victory over the Scots that established English military dominance in the Lowlands for a period. The rough wooing is not a minor episode. It is one of the most destructive wars ever fought on Scottish soil, and it was fought specifically over the body of the infant queen who had been crowned at Stirling. The castle at Stirling mattered enormously during this period, for a reason that goes beyond military strategy. It was the royal nursery. Stirling had functioned as the place where Scottish royal children were raised and educated since at least the reign of James IV. It was, by 1543, the established institutional home of the royal child who would one day need to govern. Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, herself a remarkable political operator, a French noblewoman who would govern Scotland as regent for 7 years while her daughter was in France, understood that keeping the infant queen physically secure while retaining French support was the only viable political strategy during the rough wooing. This meant keeping the queen at Stirling, which was physically formidable, and arranging for French military assistance. There is a physical detail at Stirling Castle that the popular tourism material mentions briefly, but whose significance tends to be underweighted. The hole in the outer battlements, approximately 6 inches in diameter, set at knee height for an adult. The tradition says it was made specifically for the small girl who lived here in the 1540s, cut at a height where a toddler could look through and see the plain stretching toward the mountains, the Valley of the Forth, the country that was nominally hers. Whether this specific tradition is accurate in every detail is not verifiable. What is verifiable is that Mary, Queen of Scots, spent her first years of life in this castle, was protected here, while her mother fought the English by diplomacy and eventually by French arms, and left from here in 1548. The critical move came in 1548. France offered military assistance to drive the English out and agreed to take Mary, then 5 years old, to the French court, to be raised alongside Francis, the heir to the French throne, to whom she would be married. Mary left Scotland in August 1548, carried secretly to Dumbarton Castle, and thence to a French fleet. The child who had been crowned in the Chapel Royal at Stirling in September 1543 was gone before she was 6 years old. She would not return for 13 years, by which time she was a widow. Francis II of France, having died at 16 in 1560, and Scotland had been transformed in her absence by the Protestant Reformation of 1560, a revolution that had taken place within sight of the castle walls. Mary of Guise, who had governed in her daughter's name and defended the old faith against the reformers, died in Edinburgh in June 1560. Not quite living to see the formal establishment of the Protestant Church of Scotland by Parliament in August of that year. The Scotland to which Mary returned in 1561 was not the Scotland she had left. The Church was Protestant. The French alliance was over. The castle at Stirling, where she had been crowned, and from which she had been carried as a child, stood waiting for her return, having been managed in her absence by regents whose primary motivation was usually their own factional advantage, rather than the interests of the Queen they nominally served. Chapter 6. The Queen's Return, the King's Murder, and the Castle that Kept the Heir. Mary's return to Scotland in 1561, at the age of 18, began promisingly and ended in less than 6 years in forced abdication, imprisonment, and permanent exile. The Queen, who disembarked at Leith in August 1561, had spent her formative years in the French court, was culturally French, spoke Scots as a second language, and arrived to rule a kingdom she had last seen at the age of 5. The Protestant lords who constituted her most powerful subjects had reasons religious, political, and personal to regard her with suspicion. The compromise she attempted tolerating Protestantism publicly while practicing Catholicism privately, acknowledging the Reformed Church while attending private Catholic Mass, held for longer than it might have in a more polarized environment. But the structural problems of her position were significant from the beginning. A Catholic queen in a Protestant country, a French-educated monarch, in a kingdom that had just expelled its French garrison, a woman ruling in an era that found female authority theologically questionable. Stirling Castle is wound through her Scottish personal reign in ways that the Edinburgh-centered popular narrative of her life tends to underemphasize. Edinburgh Castle was where James VI was born, on 19 June 1566. A deliberate choice by Mary, who wanted the most defensible location available for a birth she had reason to fear might be dangerous, after the murder of her secretary David Rizzio in her own apartments at Holyrood 3 months earlier. But Stirling was where James was immediately taken for his safety, where he was raised, where the continuity of the dynasty was maintained through the catastrophic years that followed. The baptism of James at Stirling in December 1566 was one of the most significant events of Mary's personal reign, and one of its most politically revealing. The ceremony was Catholic. James was christened according to Catholic rites, which further alarmed a Protestant nobility already suspicious of his mother's religious commitments. The godparents were Elizabeth I of England, who sent a magnificent gold font as a proxy gift rather than attend in person, represented by Jean, Countess of Argyll, and the kings of France and Savoy. The assembled Scottish nobility was divided. Protestant lords stood outside the chapel while the ceremony proceeded inside. Darnley, the child's father, was conspicuously absent. His marriage to Mary had already effectively collapsed. The wound of his involvement in the murder of David Rizzio, dragged from Mary's apartments and stabbed 56 times in an adjoining room while she was 6 months pregnant, too deep to heal. Rizzio's murder had been planned by Darnley in collusion with Protestant lords, who wanted the Italian secretary removed and Mary isolated. She had not forgiven Darnley. The Court of Scotland, in December 1566, was watching a marriage that was over-pretend to function. The 3-day celebrations accompanying the baptism were lavish. Mary installed a round table in the Great Hall as a symbol of the new young Arthur. Her son represented a deliberate provocation to the English guests present, who understood the implication that James would reunite Britain under a Scottish dynasty. Elizabeth's representative, Bedford, stayed outside the chapel rather than witness a Catholic ceremony. The Protestant Scottish lords kept their distance. The party was happening, and the politics were happening simultaneously, and the politics were not going in Mary's direction. Within 2 months, Darnley was dead. Darnley was murdered at Kirkhofield in Edinburgh in February 1567. His body found in the garden, strangled. The house blown up. Whether Mary knew of the murder in advance has been argued for 5 centuries and will not be resolved here, though the historian Jenny Wormald, whose research on 16th-century Scotland is the most rigorous in the field, has argued that Mary's subsequent behavior, her rapid marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, the man most widely suspected of organizing the killing, made a favorable interpretation of her role almost impossible to sustain politically, whatever the truth was legally. The Craigmillar Bond, signed in November 1566 before the baptism, committed the attending nobles to removing Darnley by one way or another. Several of those nobles were at the baptism festivities at Stirling. The celebrations in the Great Hall were attended by people who had already committed, at least on paper, to killing the absent guest of honor's father. Mary transferred James to the formal protection of John Erskine, Earl of Mar, and the castle at Stirling, before her world collapsed. After her defeat at Carberry Hill in June 1567, her forced abdication at Loch Leven, and the coronation of James VI at the Kirk of the Holy Rood, just outside Stirling's walls, on 29 July 1567. The first Protestant coronation in Scottish history. Mary's connection to the castle effectively ended. But there is a specific fact that the popular narrative almost never foregrounds. The last time Mary saw her son was at Stirling Castle. She visited James there in April 1567, shortly before her abduction by Bothwell on the road back to Edinburgh. She kissed her son goodbye. She left. She never came back. She lived for another 20 years imprisoned in England, the subject of diplomatic negotiations, the center of multiple plots, and she never held James again. He grew up in the castle where she had left him, raised by tutors whose professional and political interests were entirely separate from hers, becoming a stranger to a mother he had last seen when he was 10 months old. The hole in the Stirling battlements made, the tradition says, for the small girl who had lived here in the 1540s to look through at her realm, is still there. It is in the outer wall, at knee height for an adult, at eye height for a very young child. Whatever Mary saw through it, she left it behind in 1548. The last person who looked through it after 1567 was probably a soldier. Chapter 7. The Debunking. Why Stirling matters more than Edinburgh. But nobody tells you that. Here is the specific claim made in every piece of Scottish tourist literature, and in almost every popular history of Scotland that discusses both castles. Edinburgh Castle is the most historically significant royal fortification in Scotland, and Stirling Castle is its impressive but secondary complement. This claim is, on the historical evidence, wrong. The two castles are not interchangeable in function or significance, and the difference between them is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of structural role in Scottish history. Consider the following. Mary, Queen of Scots, was crowned at Stirling, not Edinburgh. James VI was brought to Stirling for protection from infancy and raised there, educated there, shaped there, leaving the castle for the last time in 1583 as a teenager before going south to take the English throne 20 years later. James V built the first Renaissance palace in Britain at Stirling. James IV built the finest medieval hall in Scotland at Stirling. The Battle of Bannockburn, the most celebrated event in Scottish national history, was fought because of Stirling Castle, specifically because the castle was under siege, and the terms of that siege forced Edward II to march into a battle he was not ready to fight. The Battle of Stirling Bridge, the greatest Scottish military victory before Bannockburn, was fought at the Stirling Crossing, in the castle's shadow. Edward I constructed his most fearsome siege engine specifically to reduce Stirling. Robert Bruce demolished Stirling after taking it because its strategic importance made it too dangerous to leave standing. James I was crowned here, James II married here, James III was probably born here, James IV held court here and built his masterwork here, James V built his most ambitious project here, Mary was crowned here. James VI was raised here and commissioned the last major royal building here. The castle was besieged 16 times. Every significant dynasty in Scottish history used it as its primary power center. Edinburgh Castle has the honours of Scotland, the crown jewels, whose discovery by Walter Scott and whose subsequent history is the subject of a different video. Edinburgh Castle has the Scottish National War Memorial. Edinburgh Castle has St. Margaret's Chapel, one of the oldest surviving buildings in Scotland. It has 2 million visitors a year and is, by the standards of Scottish tourism, the dominant institution. Stirling has 600,000 visitors a year. This is not a reflection of historical significance. It is a reflection of geography. Edinburgh is more accessible by train and plane from the rest of Britain, and of a marketing reality that the Scottish tourism industry has built around Edinburgh's more photogenic urban setting, its UNESCO designation, and its central position in the infrastructure of Scottish tourism. The shortbread tin version of Scotland has Edinburgh Castle on it, positioned on its volcanic plug against the Old Town skyline. The historical version of Scotland is considerably more complicated. The architectural historian John Dunbar, whose Scottish royal palaces is the authoritative study of Scottish royal buildings, is unambiguous on the comparative significance of the buildings at Stirling. The Great Hall, built by James IV at 38 meters by 11 meters, described by Dunbar as comparable in scale with all but the very largest great halls in England and the continent, is the finest medieval secular building in Scotland. Daniel Defoe, visiting in the early 18th century, called it the noblest I ever saw in Europe. This is not a modest claim. Defoe had seen a great deal of Europe. The royal palace, built by James V, is, in Dunbar's assessment, the first Renaissance palace in the British Isles, the earliest example of coherent Renaissance design anywhere in Britain, drawing on French models encountered during James V's marriages. There is no comparable building at Edinburgh. The Crown Room with the Honours is extraordinary as a collection of objects. The buildings around it are, architecturally, less remarkable than what James IV and James V built at Stirling. The Stirling heads, the oak roundels that once decorated the ceiling of the King's Presence Chamber, carved with portraits of kings, nobles, Roman emperors, mythological figures, and unidentified faces of remarkable individuality, are among the finest examples of Renaissance wood carving in Britain. The originals are in the National Museum of Scotland, in Edinburgh. Reproductions, carefully painted to match the original polychrome appearance, hang in the restored palace at Stirling. They look down from the ceiling on visitors who usually spend less than 30 seconds looking up at them, in rooms that took decades to build, and whose significance the visitor infrastructure does not fully communicate. The unicorn tapestries, reproductions of the Hunt of the Unicorn woven at West Dean College over a decade, at a cost of £2 million, hang in the Queen's Inner Hall. The restoration program that produced what visitors see today cost £21 million and was completed in 2011. This is not a minor site. It is one of the most ambitious heritage restoration projects in British history. The specific case of Mary Queen of Scots is particularly instructive. The popular narrative of Mary's life in film, in drama, in popular history, locates her emotional and political geography primarily at Edinburgh, Holyrood, and the various castles of her captivity. This is partly accurate. Holyrood was her primary official residence for most of her personal reign, and Edinburgh was the capital's political center. But her coronation, her son's safety, her son's childhood, the last time she saw her son, all of these happened at Stirling. The castle is not even secondary in her story. It is the place where her life's most permanent consequences were determined, where her son was raised by people who were not her, in a religion she had not chosen for him, in a political culture that would eventually execute her at Fotheringhay. The gap between what Mary wanted for her dynasty and what her dynasty became was produced largely in the castle at Stirling. The historian Jenny Wormald of the University of Edinburgh, who produced the most sustained academic reassessment of Mary Queen of Scots' reign, makes an observation that is relevant here. Mary has been over-romanticized in a way that has distorted historical understanding of her actual political capacities and actual political failures. The romanticization is centered on Holyrood and Edinburgh, the romantic queen, the doomed love affairs, the exotic foreigner trapped in a hostile Protestant kingdom. The political reality, the decisions, the consequences, the inheritance she left her son, and what happened to him in the nursery at Stirling is harder to romanticize and considerably more important historically. Edinburgh's castle tells you the Scottish national identity story, the honours, the war memorial, the view from the esplanade. Walter Scott's romantic version of Scotland's past. Stirling's castle tells you the Stuart dynasty story, the violence, the child monarchs, the mothers separated from their sons, The pattern of kings dying too young, in ways that guaranteed their successors would be raised by strangers. The two stories are both true. One of them is better known. That does not make it more significant. Chapter 8. The Last King in Residence, James VI. The Union of Crowns, and the End of the Royal Era. James VI of Scotland lived at Stirling Castle from infancy. He was brought there for his protection on 22 August 1566, 4 months old, accompanied by 400 to 500 armed soldiers. He would not leave the castle unsupervised until June 1579, when he made his first independent excursion, a hunting trip through the North Gate at the age of 12. The childhood of James VI at Stirling is one of the more extraordinary episodes in European royal history, and one of the least examined in popular accounts. He was raised by tutors whose approach to education was Renaissance humanist in structure and Calvinist in theology. George Buchanan, the most distinguished scholar in Scotland and one of the most distinguished in Europe, taught him Latin before he could speak Scots, a fact James proudly recorded in later life. He received an education more rigorous than any received by an English monarch of the period. Latin, Greek, French, history, rhetoric, and moral philosophy as the core curriculum, with mathematics and theology alongside. He grew up in a castle where the political atmosphere was charged with the consequences of his mother's actions. Regents succeeding each other in rapid sequence, some murdered, some overthrown, while the castle's physical fabric was still decorated with the Renaissance vision of his great-grandfather James V. The oak heads in the king's presence chamber, looking down on a child whose inheritance was simultaneously magnificent and catastrophic. The nurse assigned to James was Helen Little. The woman he addressed as Lady Minnie Mummy was Annabella Murray, wife of the Earl of Mar, who maintained a careful emotional distance from the young king but spent nights in his chambers settling him, and to whom James wrote his first recorded letter, around the age of 5, asking for fruit. She kept in contact with James throughout his life. He made her keeper of his son, Prince Henry, in 1594. The people who raised James VI were not his family. They were professional caretakers in a castle that had been the royal nursery for 3 generations. In 1571, the Earl of Lennox, James's grandfather, regent of Scotland, was assassinated at Stirling itself. James was 5 years old. He saw, or was near enough to hear, the violence in which his grandfather died. Historic Environment, Scotland's research on James VI's childhood notes that Lennox's bleeding corpse made a lasting impression on the 5-year-old king. His grandfather's successor as regent, the Earl of Mar, died in 1572 of natural causes in the castle. His successor, the Earl of Morton, governed Scotland from 1572 until 1578, before being outmaneuvered by the young king himself, who had Morton arrested for his role in the murder of James's father Darnley. Morton was eventually executed in 1581. This is the specific kind of formative political education that Stirling Castle provided its residents throughout its history. Not abstract learning about power, but direct witness to what power costs and what it does to people who hold it without restraint. James's baptism chapel, the existing Chapel Royal at Stirling, was demolished, and a new one, built in just 7 months, in 1593 to 94, commissioned by James for the baptism of his son Prince Henry, was the last major royal building constructed at the castle. James VI, who as a child had been baptized in the chapel his grandfather James V had built, ordered that chapel demolished and replaced with something better for his own son. The 1594 Chapel Royal, still standing, is described by Historic Environment Scotland as one of the first Protestant kirks in Scotland. It is also the last building from a royal commission at Stirling, the final chapter of the Stuart building program that had produced the Great Hall, the Palace, the Forework, and the older Chapel Royal over the preceding century. In 1603, James VI received the news that Elizabeth I had died and that he was now King of England. He was 36 years old. He left Edinburgh for London, passed through Stirling, and never came back to Scotland for 17 years. When he did return briefly in 1617, it was the single exception to a 30-year English residency. The royal court that had defined Stirling Castle's primary function for 2 centuries had dissolved overnight into the larger gravitational field of the English crown. The rooms that James V had decorated, the halls where Mary had held James's baptism celebrations, the nursery where James VI had learned Latin, all of this was now, suddenly, a royal residence without a resident. The castle continued to matter militarily long after it ceased to matter dynastically. Charles I was crowned in Scotland in 1633, not at Stirling, but at Holyrood, and his conflict with the Scottish Presbyterian Church generated the wars of the 3 kingdoms across Scotland, England, and Ireland. Stirling was relevant throughout. Charles II was crowned at Scone in 1651, the last reigning monarch to stay at Stirling Castle, and Cromwell's General Monk besieged and took it that same year, after a garrison mutiny forced the castle's surrender. The damage done to the Great Hall during the Cromwellian siege, still visible in the stonework, is the physical record of the castle's last serious military engagement before the Jacobite period. The 1715 and 1745 Jacobite risings both turned on Stirling. In 1715, the Earl of Mar raised the Stuart standard and attempted to take the castle with a force of approximately 8,000 men. The government army under the Duke of Argyll marched to hold it. The Battle of Sheriff Muir, fought north of the castle, near Dunblane, was inconclusive, but the Jacobites failed to take Stirling, and without Stirling, they could not secure the central belt. The rising fizzled. In 1745, Bonnie, Prince Charlie's Highland army, marched past Stirling on its way to Edinburgh. The castle's fire opening on the white flag of the Jacobite advance, Blakeney's 6-pound cannon firing 4 times without hitting the prince. When the Jacobites returned north after their failed march to Derby, they besieged the castle in January 1746. They won the Battle of Falkirk against a government relief force. They could not take the castle itself. Their artillery positions were destroyed by Blakeney's accurate counter-battery fire in a matter of hours on 30 January. The guns hit repeatedly until they were dismounted and the position abandoned. They withdrew to Inverness. 2 months later, at Culloden, the last Jacobite army was destroyed. After 1746, Stirling was never again besieged. Its military significance, the geographic reality of the Fourth Crossing, and the brooch of Scotland had been superseded by political change. Scotland was now part of Great Britain, the Highlands were being systematically pacified, and the internal military geography of Scotland was no longer the dominant consideration it had been. The castle became a barracks. Its great hall, the grandest secular space in medieval Scotland, the room where alliances had been made and destinies turned, was subdivided into accommodation for 400 soldiers. The original hammer-beam roof was removed. The bay windows were walled up. 3 floors and 5 cross walls were inserted. The finest medieval hall in Scotland became a dormitory. The palace became officers' quarters, and then a canteen and common room. The doorways between the king and queen's chambers were removed to enlarge the communal areas. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders took over the castle as their regimental depot from 1881. Their museum still occupies the King's Old Building. They left in 1964. The £21 million restoration program that followed, completed in 2011, funded by the Scottish Government, returned the Great Hall to its 1,503 appearance, rebuilt the hammer-beam roof, restored the limewash, reinstated the windows, and recreated the palace interiors in something approaching their mid-16th century character. The work took a decade. The unicorn tapestries, woven at West Dean College over 10 years at a cost of £2 million, hang in the restored Queen's Inner Hall. Chapter 9. The question the nursery cannot answer. The hole in the battlements at Stirling Castle made, the tradition says, for the toddler queen to look through at her realm is approximately 6 inches in diameter. It sits at knee height for an adult, in a stretch of outer wall above the valley. It faces west, toward the mountains. Mary, Queen of Scots, was probably not more than 5 years old when she left Stirling for France. She spent the first years of her life in this castle, brought here for her coronation at 9 months, kept here for her protection while the rough wooing raged around the country, present for the years in which the castle was simultaneously her home and her refuge from an England that wanted to own her future. The whole was, if the tradition is accurate, her specific provision, a feature made for her specifically because she was too small to see over the walls without it. It implies a particular kind of attention, someone who cared enough about what a very small girl could see and could not see, to have a hole cut in stone for her. She left in 1548 and never came back. Her son was raised in the same nursery from infancy, shaped by the same walls, looking out over the same plain, but by people who were his guardians, not his parents. James VI left in 1603 and never truly came back either. The castle that had been the institutional heart of the Stuart dynasty for 2 centuries was effectively abandoned overnight when England became available. The question that Stirling Castle poses, and that the history of the Stuart dynasty in this place makes particularly sharp, is not the question of why the dynasty was so unlucky. Luck is not the right category. The question is structural. What does it do to a political system when the person at the center of it is consistently a child? Every Stuart, from James I onward, reached the throne as a minor. James I returned from English captivity at 30, to find his kingdom governed by men who had profited from his absence. James II, 6 years old, when his father was murdered, his minority dominated by competing factions. James III, 9 years old, when his father was killed by a cannon. James IV, 15, when his father was killed at Souchiburn, wearing the iron belt of penance for the rest of his life. James V, an infant, when his father was killed at Flodden. Mary, 6 days old, when her father died. James VI, 13 months, when his mother was forced to abdicate. 7 consecutive monarchs. Every one of them began their reign as a child. Every one of their predecessors died before their time, in circumstances that were violent, sudden, or both. The pattern is not coincidence, and it is not simply bad luck. It is the product of a specific political culture, a Scottish nobility whose power depended on royal minorities, and who were therefore structurally incentivized to ensure that minorities kept occurring. The regent who governed in a child king's name wielded royal power without royal accountability. The noble faction that controlled access to the king controlled patronage, justice, and foreign policy. The castle at Stirling was the physical site of this system, the nursery where the child king was kept, the walls that separated him from the political actors who would otherwise have absorbed him, the space within which his education was managed by people whose interests did not always align with his. The historian Norman MacDougall, whose work on James III and James IV is the most detailed modern assessment of the Stuart monarchy in its most formative period, has argued that the pattern of minority rule was not simply an accident of demography, but a political institution, something the Scottish nobility had, over generations, developed methods for producing and exploiting. A king who died young left a child heir and a political space. A political space was a resource. Resources were competed for. The competition was sometimes lethal for everyone involved, including the king. The Great Hall at Stirling, restored to its late 15th century appearance after the army left in 1964, the hammer-beam roof rebuilt, the limewash restored, the parapet reconstructed with heraldic beasts, is still the finest medieval secular building in Scotland. Daniel Defoe, visiting in the early 18th century, called it the noblest I ever saw in Europe. The Stirling heads in the National Museum of Scotland, the carved oak roundels from the King's Presence Chamber, faces of kings and emperors and mythological figures executed with an individuality and technical accomplishment that has no parallel in British craftsmanship of the period, represent the peak of the Renaissance cultural project that James V was building here when he died at 30, leaving his dynasty in the hands of a 6-day-old girl. The royal palace's exterior walls are still covered with the carvings that James V commissioned classical deities, strange hybrid figures, faces that have puzzled scholars for 5 centuries. The Stirling heads in the museum are available to be looked at closely, individually, by anyone willing to make the journey. The hole in the battlements is still there, at knee height, facing the mountains. What the nursery cannot answer is the simplest question the pattern raises. Did any of these children, growing up in this castle with its extraordinary architecture and its political history and its view over the brooch of Scotland, understand what they were growing up in? Did James VI, educated in Latin and Greek and theology and rhetoric, while regents murdered each other in the courtyard below, understand that the castle around him was the product of a specific kind of violence, the violence of fathers dying young and children inheriting too soon? He probably did. He was well educated and perceptive. He wrote books on governance, on witchcraft, on poetry that reflect a mind shaped by exactly the kind of intense institutional education that Stirling's nursery provided. Whether that understanding helped him is another question. He left for London in 1603 and governed Scotland at a distance for the rest of his reign. The crown and the country, separated by the same gap that had separated Mary from her son geography, substituting for politics, absence substituting for resolution. What the castle itself keeps is not the answer to any of these questions. It keeps the physical record. The hammer-beam roof of the Great Hall, restored to its 1,503 appearance after the Army's floor-upon-floor adaptation was removed, catches the light in ways it has caught light for 5 centuries. The carved faces of the Stirling heads kings and emperors and nameless figures, carved by craftsmen whose names are mostly lost. Look down from the reproduction roundels in the King's Presence Chamber as they look down on the regents and the child king beneath them. The hole in the outer wall, at knee height, faces the mountains. 6 centuries of Scottish history happened on this rock, the brooch that joins the 2 halves of Scotland, the text says. That is the geographic claim. The historical claim is slightly different. Everything that determined what Scotland became, the wars of independence that established its political identity, the Stuart dynasty that shaped its court culture and its architectural inheritance, the pattern of violent deaths and child monarchs that produced the specific political vulnerability the Stuart name came to symbolize. All of this turned on this castle, on this crossing, on this rock above the river. The castle is still there. The Great Hall is lime-washed in royal gold, as it was in 1503. The palace is decorated in the colors that James V's court would have seen. The unicorn tapestries, reproductions of the Hunt of the Unicorn, woven at West Dean College in West Sussex over a decade, at a cost of £2 million, hang in the Queen's Inner Hall, where Mary of Guise's tapestries once hung. 609,000. 698 people visited in 2019, the last full pre-pandemic year for which figures are available. Edinburgh Castle, in the same year, received over 2 million. The difference is not significance. It is marketing. It is geography. It is the specific story that Scotland's tourism industry has decided to tell about itself. The shortbread tin story has Edinburgh on it. The history has Stirling. The hole in the wall is still there, at knee height, facing west.